2 cassettes. That was everything John Kennedy brought to the table. Not a binder, not a research team feeding him questions through an earpiece, not a stack of exhibits with color-coded tabs. 2 cassettes in the pocket of his jacket and a small black recorder, the kind you find in a junk drawer next to dead batteries, and a phone charger for a device you no longer own, sitting on the table in front of him. When he pressed the square stop button and the click of it echoed through a room that had gone completely still, Adam Schiff sat very straight in his chair. His chin maintained its customary elevation, but a small muscle high in his cheek had begun its own independent movement, a steady, involuntary flutter that the cameras found and held and would not let go. Kennedy looked across the table at the man who had spent the previous 40 minutes performing confidence for the networks and said, almost gently, the words that ended the morning. He said, "That's your own voice. I did not put those words in your mouth. I just kept the receipt." To understand how the man cable networks had spent a decade positioning as the most formidable prosecutor in Congress was dismantled by a cheap audio device and a Louisiana senator he had dismissed as community theater. You need to go back 40 minutes, back to when Adam Schiff walked into that hearing room, absolutely certain he was the most capable person in it, and equally certain that the deliberate, soft-spoken man across the table was something he could clean off his shoes without effort. He had outlasted sharper adversaries than John Kennedy or believed he had. He had spent years in television studios where the lighting flatters and no one requires you to produce what you promised you possessed. He had been in enough rooms where the performance of having evidence was sufficient substitute for the evidence itself. He had, somewhere along the way, allowed himself to forget that a hearing room with a patient man and a functional recording device operates by different rules than a Sunday morning program with a sympathetic host. The room was filled to capacity when the session opened because Washington functions on the anticipation of public conflict, and word had circulated that Kennedy had specifically requested to question Schiff directly. The press had framed it the way the press frames everything requiring narrative simplicity, the seasoned California prosecutor with the prosecutorial bearing against the folksy Louisiana senator who used ain't as a rhetorical strategy and said it on purpose. Most of the room had already written the outcome. Most of the room had written it wrong. Schiff arrived the way headliners arrive, last, unhurried, with the bearing of someone entering a space that has been holding its breath waiting for him. He arranged his materials. He adjusted his glasses. When the chairman recognized him, he wasted nothing on pleasantries, because he had not come for pleasantries. He had come to deliver something he had delivered many times before, in many rooms, and he was good at it in the specific way that repeated performance produces a kind of competence that can be mistaken for depth. He thanked the chairman in a voice he reserved for solemn occasions, measured, weighted, pitched to communicate that a serious person was speaking. He said they were living through a dangerous period. He said truth itself was under active assault from a political movement that had conditioned its followers to distrust expertise, dismiss factual analysis, and treat verified reality as merely one opinion among many equally valid options. He paused to let that settle. He said there were places in this country where truth had effectively ceased to be a usable currency, where a person could say the most extravagant and unsubstantiated things and receive enthusiastic approval, provided they said them with the right kind of accent, in the right kind of room, to audiences who had been persuaded that comfortable deception was preferable to uncomfortable accuracy. He turned slightly. He let his gaze rest on Kennedy for the first time. He permitted himself a small, controlled smile. He said he would be honest about his expectations for the hearing. He said he had observed Senator Kennedy's performance style on prior occasions. The reading glasses positioned strategically down the nose, the regional vocabulary deployed with practiced timing. The folksy philosopher presentation that generated robust engagement on short-form video platforms. He said it played very well to certain audiences. He said he had come up in actual courtrooms, however, where juries were not swayed by regional charm, where you were required to possess genuine knowledge rather than merely project the appearance of it, where the difference between a compelling story and verified evidence was the entire point of the exercise. He suggested, with the patient regret of a man correcting a widespread misunderstanding, that a regional accent was not a logical argument, that folksy was not equivalent to truthful, and that the audiences who responded enthusiastically to Senator Kennedy's presentation were doing so because the presentation made them feel intelligent without requiring the inconvenience of actually becoming so. He said this in the calm, sorrowful register of a man who believed he was performing a public service. In the space of 3 minutes, he had reached past the senator sitting across from him, directly through the cameras, and into the living rooms and kitchens and vehicles of every person watching who did not live in a coastal metropolitan area, and told them that their instincts were the product of manipulation, that their enthusiasm was the enthusiasm of the successfully deceived, that the reason they saw the world differently from Adam Schiff was that no one had yet educated them sufficiently to see it correctly. He delivered this verdict with the voice of a compassionate physician sharing a difficult diagnosis. He believed it had landed exactly where he aimed it. It had landed. He had simply misjudged the target by several million people. Kennedy did not react. This was the first significant miscalculation Schiff made about him, and it established the pattern for the morning. Kennedy sat with his glasses where Schiff had described them, hands resting together on the table, and allowed the insult to pass him the way weather passes. He had been called worse by people who were better at it. He waited until the chairman gave him the floor, and then he did not reach for any equivalent insult, because that was not the approach he had arrived with. He thanked Schiff, warmly and without any visible irony. He said, "Congressman Schiff, I want you to know I take no offense at anything you said about me. You were right about the reading glasses. My wife says they make me look like a man trying to read a menu in a dim restaurant." A gentle laugh from his side of the room. He said he was just a country lawyer who had learned his trade in a courthouse where the air conditioning was unreliable and the judge had known him since childhood. He said he was going to need Schiff's assistance that morning because Schiff was clearly the sharper of the two of them. And he had some questions about things Schiff had said publicly, and he was hoping Schiff could help a slow man understand them. Schiff said he was happy to educate the committee. Kennedy said he was grateful to hear that and asked him to hold on to that generous impulse because they were going to need it shortly. A good trap does not announce itself. It arrives looking like an old man taking his time. Kennedy said he wanted to go back a ways to a period when Schiff had been appearing on television with considerable regularity. He said he had the impression during that period that Schiff had essentially taken up residence on the cable networks, which he mentioned without accusation as a simple observation about the schedule. During those appearances, Kennedy said Schiff had made a statement that had stayed with him. Because he was a simple man, he remembered simple things. And what Schiff had said, on multiple occasions, was that he had seen evidence of coordination between a presidential campaign and a foreign government. Kennedy said he wanted to make sure he was characterizing this accurately. Schiff had not said it was possible. He had not said it warranted investigation. He had said he had seen it. He had said the evidence was, and Kennedy paused to indicate he was being precise, more than circumstantial. Those were the words Schiff had used. Did Schiff remember saying them? Schiff said he remembered the period. He characterized it as a serious investigation into a serious threat to the democratic process, an investigation that members of Kennedy's party had worked to obstruct. Kennedy said, "That's not what I asked, son." He said it without heat, the way you return a child gently to the page they were supposed to be reading. He asked again, did Schiff say those words more than circumstantial? Did he say them, or had Kennedy misremembered? Schiff said he stood by everything he had said during that period. Kennedy nodded with the satisfied expression of a man who had received precisely the order he placed. He said he was glad to hear it. He said he had been hoping Schiff would say that, because he wanted to give Schiff the opportunity, right here in this room in front of all these people, to finally show them the more. He said the country had waited 2 years on that more. He said they should stop waiting. He said the floor was Schiff's. What was the evidence that was more than circumstantial? And there it was, the first visible movement in Schiff's certainty. It crossed his face briefly before the professional discipline reasserted itself. He said, "That's a gross oversimplification of a complex," Kennedy said. "It's a real simple question, Congressman." He said he hadn't asked about a complex anything. He had asked about the more. The thing Schiff had said was more than circumstantial. "Show it to the room," Schiff said. The investigation documented extensive contacts between the campaign and Russian. Kennedy said, "I didn't ask about contacts." He said he knew people who had contacts with all manner of individuals without those contacts constituting criminal conduct. He said he had asked about collusion, the thing Schiff said he had seen, the thing that was more than circumstantial. What was it? What followed was Schiff reaching instinctively for the speech about democracy and threats and the long perspective of history. Kennedy waited with the patience of someone who had no particular appointment after this one. Then he did the thing nobody in the room had anticipated. He reached down, unhurried, and set the small black cassette recorder on the table. He regarded it for a brief moment, the way a craftsman regards a tool he has used many times and trusts completely. He pressed a button with one deliberate finger. The sound that came out was thin, filtered through decades and cheap speakers, but completely unmistakable. It was Adam Schiff's voice, younger, assured, positioned in front of camera lights in the full confidence of a man who believed he was holding something the country needed. The voice said, "I can tell you that the case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now." Kennedy pressed stop. He let the echo of it occupy the room for a moment, the ghost of a younger, more confident version of the man now sitting very still across from him. He said, "That's you. I'm given to understand it comes from a program called Meet the Press. We don't receive it reliably down in Madisonville. Our TV pulls in mainly weather reports and high school athletic competitions." A handful of people laughed. Kennedy did not. He said, "Here's the thing that has been troubling a simple country lawyer, Congressman. You said you couldn't go into the particulars. That was the specific word you chose, particulars, and at the time I thought that was reasonable. A man doesn't expose the whole of his hand in the middle of an active investigation. The country understood that. People were patient about it. They waited." He folded his hands. He said, "But the investigation concluded a considerable time ago. The report was written. The investigators went home. There is nothing in this world now preventing you from going into the particulars, so please go ahead. The floor is entirely yours. The cameras are running. We have all been waiting a long time." What were the particulars? The muscle in Schiff's cheek resumed its independent movement. His hand found the edge of his folder and held it. He said, "The investigation established a pattern of conduct that any reasonable—" Kennedy said, "Particulars, Congressman. Not patterns, not what any reasonable person might suppose. You made a promise on camera to 200 million people. You said the word yourself. I just played it for you. All I'm asking is that you keep that promise." What were the particulars? Schiff climbed for the high ground. He aimed his gaze past Kennedy toward the cameras because that was where he had always been most effective, and he summoned the wounded dignity he kept in reserve for moments when the factual terrain became difficult. He said the American people deserved better than a hearing being reduced to a partisan performance. He said he had fulfilled his constitutional obligations while others in that body had chosen to look away. He said history would ultimately render its judgment on who had been on the correct side. Kennedy said, "I expect it will, but history's going to want particulars too, son. It tends to, in my experience." The room laughed, and the laugh had more weight in it than the earlier ones, because people were beginning to understand the architecture of what was happening. The way the same plate kept being placed in front of Schiff, and the way Schiff kept identifying reasons he was not going to eat from it. This was where the folksy quality in Kennedy's voice did not disappear exactly, but something was added underneath it, something flat and deliberate and done being entertained. He said, "Let me tell you what I believe happened, and you can correct me because you are the sharp one between us. I keep saying so." He said, "I think you went on those television programs night after night, and you told a frightened country that you possessed something you did not possess. I think you said more than circumstantial because it sounded like a man guarding a significant secret, and a man guarding a significant secret gets invited back to tell more of the story. I think you understood at all times, in the part of yourself that always knows, that when someone eventually required you to place the evidence on the table would remain empty." He paused. He said, "And here we are. And the table is empty." Schiff's voice went tight and careful. All the resonant gravity drained from it into something lawyerly and defensive. He said that was a disgraceful mischaracterization. Kennedy said, "Then characterize it correctly. I'm genuinely asking you to show me the more. Place it here. I am not being rhetorical. I want to see it." He reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a second cassette. He held it between two fingers for a moment, the way a fisherman holds something he caught without requiring any effort, and is mildly proud of. Then he loaded it into the recorder and pressed play. The same voice, the same week, approximately. But in this recording, Schiff was describing the evidence differently. In this recording, the word he used was simply circumstantial. Not more than. Just circumstantial. Kennedy pressed stop. He set the recorder down. He said, "Now I am genuinely confused, and I mean that, Congressman. Because that recording is from a few days before the other one. In that one, the evidence is circumstantial. In the later one, the same evidence has become more than circumstantial. Same evidence, same investigation, same man, roughly the same week." He removed the glasses slowly and set them on the table. He said, "Help a country lawyer understand how evidence grows over a weekend. Because in my experience, evidence does not grow. Evidence is what it is. The story grows, the story gets bigger and more confident and more useful for certain purposes. But the evidence stays exactly the size it was when it was first found. And from what I can see, the size here was nothing whatsoever. The laugh that came this time had an unpleasant edge. The laugh of a room that has watched a man it was told to admire turn hollow when you knock on him. Down the dais, a senior Democratic senator who had spent 20 years in the chamber and had no remaining elections to win, leaned toward his microphone. He did not defend his colleague. He said in the flat, exhausted voice of someone reading from a document that says something they wish it didn't. The Mueller report did not establish coordination. That is simply what the report says. We can dispute other aspects, but that portion is the text. He sat back. The small, deliberate refusal to throw a rope said more than any speech could have. Schiff's own party had assessed the situation and decided not to go down with him. When a young aide behind Schiff leaned forward to murmur something and Schiff began reaching for the framework of grievance, the man being bullied by institutional power, the circus being performed for a particular audience, Kennedy headed it off before it could establish itself. He said, "Before you say I'm performing for my voters, I want to be clear about something. I have a lot of respect for the people who sent me here. You described them as too credulous to recognize truth about 40 minutes ago. You said the truth goes to my part of the country to die. You characterized their approval as the response of people too, limited to distinguish honest reporting from skillful performance." He paused. He said, "I didn't insult your voters. You insulted mine. On camera, on purpose. So let's not construct a version of this morning where I'm the one who walked in looking down on people." A woman in the gallery, in a practical outdoor jacket, started applauding before she had finished deciding to, and others followed, and the chairman had to use the gavel. Schiff sat in the center of it with his jaw set and his eyes direct and very bright. Kennedy picked the recorder up again, turning it over once in his hand. With no particular emphasis, he said, "Here is the part that actually troubles me, not the original overstatement. Men say things they can't fully support when the pressure is high and the cameras are running. I have been in that position. I expect everyone in this room has." He said, "What troubles me is what happened after the report, after the investigation concluded, and the investigators published their findings and went home. After there was no coordination to be found, not in 2 years of work by the most resourced investigative apparatus in the world. A reporter asked you a plain question, whether, looking back, you wished you had been more careful with the specific language you had used, whether you regretted telling the country you had personally seen evidence that was more than circumstantial. He read from a single card. He said you responded that your words had been precise, that they had been accurate, and that the confusion surrounding them existed because the public had been misled by others into misunderstanding what you meant. He set the card face down. He said, "Let me make sure I have that correctly. The report said coordination was not established. You had told the country you had personally seen evidence that it existed. Those two things cannot simultaneously be true. One of them requires revision. And when you were handed the specific moment that allows a public figure to say, 'Perhaps I stated my certainty beyond what the underlying information warranted,' you declined to take it. You maintained that you had been precise. You suggested the country's misunderstanding was the country's problem." He shook his head. He said, "That is not a man who made a mistake, Congressman. A man who made a mistake says so. 3 words, simple words that any person who has been wrong before knows how to say. I was wrong. You couldn't find them then. I'd like to offer you the opportunity now in front of this room and the cameras and the people watching at home. Try if you like. I'll wait. I have nowhere pressing to be." The room watched Schiff. The chin maintained its elevation. The 3 words did not come. Kennedy set the recorder aside with the finality of a man putting away a tool he has finished using. His voice changed when he spoke again. Not dramatically. There was no theatrical shift, no deliberate modulation to signal that something different was happening. What changed was simply that the ease departed and what remained was level and quiet and very serious. He said, "I want to stop for a minute. Because there's a portion of this that isn't something I can make amusing, and the people watching deserve to hear it said plainly." He said, "What happened here wasn't simply a public figure misjudging the evidence before him. People misjudge evidence. That's the ordinary condition of operating under uncertainty with incomplete information. I do it. Everyone in this room does it. That's not a failure. That's a Tuesday in a complicated world." He paused. He said, "What happened here was something specific. A man took a thing he could not demonstrate, and he distributed it to a frightened country in careful portions over 2 years. A little more each week, always enough to sustain the fear. Never enough to constitute the proof he was claiming to possess. And he did this from a platform of trust that the public had extended to him because he held a position that was supposed to mean he had access to things they didn't. His voice dropped. He said, "I want to be direct about the damage. Not the political damage, which can be measured and debated, the actual damage. The kind that happens in ordinary places to ordinary people who were watching those programs every night and trusting what they heard." He said, "I know a man in Ohio who stopped attending his own family's Thanksgiving dinner because his daughter's husband had voted in a way that the TV had informed him made that man practically an agent of a foreign power. They had shared a table for 11 years. They do not share one now." He said he knew 2 men in Louisiana who had operated a commercial fishing vessel together for over 3 decades, splitting the work and the profit and the hard days equally, and who no longer speak over a thing that the authoritative investigation subsequently said was not there. He said he could keep going, because every member of this body knew people in their districts who had versions of the same story. He said half the country spent 2 years being told their neighbors were traitors, and their president was a foreign asset, and that the proof was almost in hand. Almost here. Almost ready to be revealed. More than circumstantial, just not yet ready for disclosure. The other half spent 2 years being told they were fools for not seeing it, dupes for defending someone who was obviously compromised. He said 2 solid years. And the proof that was almost ready never arrived because there was never any almost about it. There was a phrase that carried well on camera and a country that had been positioned to believe the person saying the phrase had access to something real. He said, "I am not going to use a heavy word for what that is. Heavy words are easy to throw and difficult to take back, and I am not in the business of throwing them carelessly. But I will say this, our adversaries have spent considerable resources attempting to fracture this country from the outside, attempting to set Americans against each other to erode the trust that makes collective life possible. I am not going to speculate about the motives of anyone in this hearing. I am simply going to observe that the fracturing that occurred across those 2 years was as thorough as anything any external actor has managed to produce in recent memory. He let it sit there. He said, and it was produced from the inside, for airtime, by a man the public trusted to be more careful with his words than he turned out to be. Nobody laughed. Nobody applauded. The comment went somewhere below those registers into the region, a room reserves for the things it recognizes as accurate and significant and uncomfortable to sit with. Schiff tried one final time. He was not a person who understood how to stop, and he was not going to learn in this room on this morning. He found the grave voice again, the voice that had carried him through hundreds of segments and fundraising events and green rooms from Washington to Los Angeles. He began to speak about moral clarity, about the courage required to pursue difficult truths against institutional resistance, about the inevitable vindication that history extends to people willing to stand in positions that are unpopular in their own time. Something had changed in the room, though. He could feel it changing because he was not unintelligent. Whatever else the morning had established about him, the voice that had always worked, the cadence that had been his reliable instrument for years, was generating no response from the faces in front of him. The reporters were not writing it down. Members of his own party were finding the grain of the table in front of them suddenly worthy of close examination. The speech that had never once failed him was failing him now, sentence by sentence, and he could hear it failing the way a driver can hear a car refusing to start. Each attempt producing less than the previous one, and he kept going, because he had never had anything to replace it, and stopping was the one thing he was not willing to do, because to stop was to acknowledge in front of everyone that the performance had always been the whole of it. Kennedy did not interrupt. He let him run completely down. That patience, the willingness to simply sit and allow a man to exhaust himself against a silence that would not receive him, carried its own verdict. It was a kind of mercy and a kind of judgment simultaneously, and the room understood it as both. When Schiff had produced his final sentence, and the room had returned precisely nothing, not a nod, not a murmur, not a single face inclined toward him on either side of the aisle, Kennedy reached for the recorder. He turned it over once in his hand. He said, "You had the microphone for 2 years, Congressman. Every camera in the country. The trust of people who believed that someone in your position, with your access, would not use those cameras to say things they could not support. You had all of that." He set the recorder on the table. He said, "You didn't deceive a country. You sold 8 words. And they accomplished what 2 hours of argument had not, because they did not attack, and they did not perform, and they did not reach for anything. They simply described the shape of what had happened in plain language, and then stopped. Schiff reached for his folder. His fingers found the edge of it and began a rapid, irregular percussion against the tabletop, a quick, involuntary drumming that he did not appear to realize was happening until he became aware that the room had become aware of it. He looked down at his own hand with the expression of someone encountering a stranger. Then he pressed it flat to the table and held it there with visible effort, enforcing stillness through conscious pressure. He raised his chin. He stared at a point straight ahead, at nothing in particular, refusing even here, even now, to let his face complete the admission that the morning had already made on his behalf. The chairman asked whether the gentleman wished to respond. The gentleman sat rigid and alone in the center of a room that had recently cheered for him regularly, and now would not locate his eyes. He did not wish to respond. The image that ran on every broadcast by dinner was that one, Schiff sitting with his chin elevated and his hand pressed flat against the table, and his eyes aimed at nothing in a room that had gone completely silent around him. One network played 2 audio clips back to back without narration or graphics. The first clip from one broadcast, circumstantial. The second clip from a broadcast days later, more than circumstantial. Then Kennedy's 8 words in plain text on a dark background. No anchor commentary. No panel discussion. The tape had already done all the work that words could improve upon. The clip was everywhere before the hearing room had finished emptying. Someone had isolated 90 seconds with surgical precision, the recorder clicking on, the thin voice promising particulars that could not be disclosed, the old man across the table setting down his glasses and saying, with all the patience in the world, that the investigation was now concluded and the particulars were welcome to arrive at any time, and then the silence where the particulars did not arrive. Nobody was arguing about the politics of it by midnight. The political argument required 2 positions, and one of the positions had ceased to be available. People were simply watching a man who had characterized an entire region of the country as too credulous to recognize truth, get asked to produce what he had promised on a loop, and declining to do it on a loop, and watching the loop without any desire to argue about the loop because the loop did not require argument. In the marble corridor outside the chamber, a journalist stopped a Democratic communications strategist who had spent years securing shift bookings on every program with an available slot. The strategist checked the hallway in both directions before speaking and then spoke quickly. He said, everybody in this city knew, it was understood by everyone working in this space, that there were never any particulars. That was always the structure of the thing. He goes on, he looks like someone guarding something, he says more is coming, and the bookings increase, and the fundraising increases, and the profile increases. He shook his head. The problem isn't that he got something wrong. This entire city runs on getting things wrong. The problem is that a recording of him getting it wrong in 2 directions in the same week is now available to everyone who has internet access, and the old man from Louisiana waited until the precise moment to play both of them, and you cannot explain your way out of your own voice. He left before the recorder was positioned correctly. A Democratic senator who had served alongside Schiff for a decade was asked about it near the elevator bank and offered a more precise analysis. She said the difficulty was not that anyone believed he had fabricated his certainty from nothing. People in that period had been working from genuine fear and genuinely ambiguous information, and she counted herself among them in the early days when the situation still seemed interpretable in multiple directions. The difficulty, she said, was what the tape made audible. It did not sound like a man who had believed something and been wrong about it. It sounded like a man who had understood the value of the performance, who had calibrated the language to maximize the response rather than to accurately describe the evidence, who had said what he said because saying it was good for Adam Schiff, the profile, the platform, the position. And when the investigation concluded without the particulars materializing, a man who had been genuinely wrong would have looked relieved. What the camera had captured instead was a man who looked caught. Not a man who regretted the error. A man who regretted the accountability. Kennedy did what Kennedy did, which was nothing that required an audience. He gathered the 2 cassettes from the recorder with the unhurried efficiency of someone collecting tools after the job is done. He placed them in the inside pocket of his jacket. He shook the hands that were extended and declined the questions that were called after him, and walked out through the side door at a pace that suggested he had other things to attend to. He passed the cameras calling his name. He passed the empty chair where the man who had spent 2 years promising evidence had eventually run completely out of words. He had arrived with 2 cassettes in his pocket. He left with them in the same pocket. They were a little lighter than they sounded, but they had been exactly enough. There is one thing worth adding before this is finished, because it belongs to the morning, and it was not on any camera. In the gallery during the hearing, positioned in a row near the back, were several people who had driven significant distances that morning to be present. People who had watched those 2 years of nightly broadcasts. People who had rearranged their understanding of the world around information they had been told was nearly confirmed. People who had argued with family members and colleagues and old friends about things that the authoritative investigation had subsequently found insufficient to establish. They had not come for the partisan performance. They had come because something had been done to them, and they had never had anyone say so in a room with cameras. When Kennedy set the recorder on the table and pressed the button the second time, and the voice came through the small speaker saying the evidence was more than circumstantial, and then Kennedy played the recording from a few days earlier, in which the same voice described the same evidence simply as circumstantial, several of those people in the gallery became very still. Not because of the politics of it, because of the recognition. The recognition that the thing they had been told with such grave and measured certainty had been shaped for transmission rather than for accuracy. That the language had been calibrated to what it would produce rather than to what it could demonstrate. That the performance of certainty had been the product, and they had been the audience, and the audience had not been informed that it was a performance. 2 cassettes, a cheap recorder. A patient man who understood that the most effective thing you can do with a promise is wait until the person who made it is required to keep it in front of witnesses. The truth, it turned out, did not require a sophisticated delivery system. It just required someone willing to press the button.